everyone. Good afternoon and good morning for those who are joining from Europe. My name is Clemence Aaron. I'm Program Director, and I'm here today with Miriam Israel, who is the head of the UN Migration in Hong Kong. And we are happy to welcome you on to this webinar that is focused on a very important aspect of supply chain due diligence, which is remediation. So I'm going to briefly, before we start, I'm going to briefly introduce the Mekong Club. We are a membership-based organization that works with the private sector to address modern slavery. So we work with multinational brands in various sectors, such as retail, apparel and footwear, manufacturing, hospitality, construction, and banking. And what we do is that we help companies develop an anti-slavery strategy. We develop tools and resources to help companies address those issues in their supply chains. We hold working group sessions to discuss different topics to respond to the needs of our members. We also offer training, provide consultations, review policies, and we help companies with remediation. So today we're here. So today, our main focus will be due diligence and remediation. So first, to begin with, Miriam will talk about the problem of forced labor in global supply chains. Then I will introduce the requirements of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that will be voted soon. Then we will talk about more practical tools, and Miriam will introduce the IOM due diligence toolkits. I will introduce the Mekong Club remediation toolkit. And finally, we will show some good examples of companies providing remediation. And at the end of the session, we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat box. Thank you. Miriam, over to you.
Thank you, Clemence. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join this session. So some of you may already be familiar with IOM, but for those who are not, IOM is the UN Migration Agency established in 1951. IOM is committed to the principle that humane and orderly migration benefits migrants and society. As such, IOM acts with its partners to assist in meeting the growing operational challenges of migration management, advance understanding of migration issues, encourage social and economic development through migration, and uphold the human dignity and well-being of migrants. Next slide. So as of 2023, IOM has 174 member states with offices in over 450 locations. And the structure of IOM is we're headquartered in Geneva with 2 administrative centers in Manila and Panama and 9 regional offices. In addition, IOM also has a global migration data portal, which was launched in 2017. And this serves as a one-stop access point for timely, comprehensive migration statistics and reliable information about migration data globally. So we work with various stakeholders such as border management to understand movements across borders. We work with communities and civil societies in particular for irregular migration, and with private sector actors to understand migrants working in their supply chains and in their businesses. So this global coverage provides IOM with a distinct overview and understanding of forced labor trends across the world. Next slide. So what is forced labor to begin? So I'll start with playing a video. As you can see, the most recent figures released by IOM, ILO, and Walk Free show that there are nearly 50 million victims of modern slavery. So a simple comparison, and this forced labor has grown in recent years. A simple comparison with the 2016 global estimates indicate an increase of 2.7 million in the number of people in forced labor between 2016 and 2021. So a lot of this was really perpetuated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this translates to a rise of in prevalence of forced labor from 3.4 to 3.5% per thousand people in the world. No region of the world is spared from forced labor, and Asian Pacific is host to more than half of the global total, followed by Europe and Central Asia and the Americas. But this regional ranking changes considerably when you're looking at forced labor as an expression of as a proportion of the population. So by this measure, forced labor is highest in the Arab states, followed by Europe and Central Asia. So, and then the Americas and Asia and the Pacific. Next slide. So why is this important for IOM in particular? So globally, there are 169 million migrant workers, representing around 5% of the global workforce. Asia Pacific is a destination for 42 million international migrants and an origin for 83 million migrants. The majority of migrant workers are employed in global supply chains in sectors such as agricultural, construction, fisheries, food processing, manufacturing, services, and tourism. And the most recent figures from, once again, 2021 indicate that there are about 29 million victims of forced labor, with over 15 million cases of forced labor found in Asia. So more than half of the global total. So important for us is migrants experience instances of forced labor 3 times more likely in comparison to non-migrant workers. And most importantly, the report also found that businesses or the private sector is responsible for 86% of the forced labor cases. So therefore, in the context of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, companies sourcing across the world will therefore be required to take more comprehensive and better action to address those risks experienced by migrant workers affected by their operations and their supply chains. Next. So what are the risk factors? When we look at risk factors affecting especially migrant workers, we look at 3 phases. One, during recruitment. So during recruitment, you experience high recruitment fees and related costs, as well as debt and debt bondage. There's often lack of transparency and deception, lack of freedom of choice. And during employment, we look at distant work deficit and exploitation, discrimination, harassment, and abuse, poor living conditions, irregular migration status, and fear of deportation. We also look at the return and reintegration. The return and reintegration piece, which is particularly important for migrant workers, comes with its own risk factors, looking at indebtedness and pressures to remigrate, unemployment, lack of skills recognition, and stigmatization within their own host communities of origins. Next. Sorry, can you post the video? So how can businesses mitigate these risk factors? But with regards to respecting human rights in the conduct of business, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are the most important sources. And I think many of you, of course, know the UNGPs, and these contain 10 principles that oblige states to protect human rights, and 14 principles that deal with the responsibilities of companies to respect human rights. So I won't go too much into details. I would just play these very self-explanatory videos on the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights.
Businesses impact human rights wherever and however they operate. These impacts can be positive or they can be negative. These days, companies are global, and that means their impacts are too. Companies operate in poor countries and post-conflict countries, in countries where the local government is unable or unwilling to enforce its own laws. With all this complexity, it's not always clear who's responsible for preventing companies from violating human rights. In 2011, the United Nations issued a set of principles that define the responsibilities of governments and businesses for solving this dilemma. So what do these principles say? There's 3 pillars. The first says that governments have to make sure that businesses don't violate anyone's human rights. That means passing laws that prevent human rights violations, but also making sure these laws are implemented. Some of the world's largest multinational corporations are owned and operated by states. The guiding principles say that governments have to prevent human rights violations by businesses, even if the state itself is acting like one. The second pillar says that businesses have to refrain from violating human rights wherever and however they do business. That means it's not enough for companies to simply follow the law where they operate, or to audit a few of their suppliers. Even in countries where the government doesn't take up its own duty, companies have to know their human rights impacts and take concrete steps to improve them. The guiding principles don't offer any loopholes. Companies are responsible for all human rights. Doing things like building a school or digging a well doesn't get them out of their basic responsibility not to make their workers and communities worse off. Companies have to perform human rights due diligence. That means talking to the people whose lives they might be affecting. Like the government responsibility, respecting human rights isn't a switch that companies can turn on and off. It's a continuous process. The third pillar of the guiding principles is about what happens when something goes wrong. If a company abuses human rights, governments have to make sure that the court system or some other legitimate process allows the victims to file a complaint and that that complaint is investigated and settled. Companies have this obligation too. Part of human rights due diligence is allowing people affected by the company to file grievances and participating in processes to make them right. Whatever route they choose, remedy mechanisms should fit with the effectiveness criteria defined by the guiding principles. If the complaint system is slow, or it costs too much money, or it's far away, it doesn't count.
Now, since the introduction of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011, there are many more human rights due diligence regulations enforcing international frameworks. And this spans from Canada being the most recent to Australia and the UK being the most the ones that have been around for quite some time. And this is really moving from soft law to hard law. And then, of course, the recent EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which Clemence will speak a little bit more. Back over to you, Clemence.
Thank you, Miriam. So, as Miriam mentioned, there is growing momentum for human rights due diligence legislation all over the world. And today I would like to talk about a very important development, which is the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Over the past decade, as you know, companies have been relying on audits. And what I observe now is that companies are taking a more proactive approach, shifting away from social compliance to implementing a management system that helps them identify, prevent, mitigate human rights impacts in their supply chains, and implementing human rights due diligence processes. And you probably know the steps of human rights due diligence, but that framework, as it was introduced by the UN Guiding Principles in Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs, that you just saw on the video, and also the OECD guidelines. And it requires that framework requires companies to have a system in place to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how human rights impacts are being addressed in supply chains and in the company's operation. And it has 6 steps. And those steps, if you look at different pieces of legislation on modern slavery or human rights due diligence, they are based on this framework. The first step is to commit to have policies and procedures to ensure that responsible business conduct is embedded in the management system, then to conduct risk assessments to identify the risks in your business operation and supply chains, look at high risk geographies and sectors and where you have risk in your supply chain, then to take appropriate action. So have an action plan and implement when there is a risk that was identified, take action to ensure that is being addressed. And if there are some violations in the supply chain, then companies should ensure remedy, that workers have access to complaint channel and can report concerns, and then provide remediation. Finally, companies based on this framework of human rights due diligence should monitor in progress, see what works, what doesn't work, and communicate and report. And so the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that I'm going to introduce is based on that framework. Just to give you a little bit of background, this is, so the European Commission made a proposal in February 2022, a proposal for a directive on due diligence that requires company to establish a system to identify, bring to an end, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights and also environmental impacts in the company's own operation and the value chains. That initial proposal was reviewed by the EU Council, who drafted a position paper in December 2022. So there were some suggestion of changes. And then in April this year, in 2023, the Parliament had drafted a report with some new amendments. And the text is expected to be voted in June 2023. And then there will be some negotiation between the Commission, the Council, the Parliament. And once it will be adopted, member states will have 2 years to translate that into national law. Why has this directive been created? Well, because the EU wanted to set a horizontal framework to enhance human rights and environmental protection. Also, the goal is to create a level playing field for companies within the EU, knowing that there are some initiatives such as the French Duty of Vigilance Law or the German Supply Chain Act that may differ. So the goal of that legislation is to ensure that policies are being harmonized and so that there are like a better response from EU companies when it comes to protecting human rights and the environment. And this directive is not something that will impact the company itself only, but also the chain of activity. And the chain of activity means the company's upstream and downstream business partners, so direct and indirect business partners. So I'm going to provide an update on the latest report by the EU Parliament that is setting threshold criteria for companies that will be affected. So there will be different groups, but the directive should be applicable to EU companies, but also non-EU companies. In terms of companies in the EU, should be companies having more than 250 employees and a turnover of more than 40 million. There's another group for companies operating in high-risk sectors. And by high risk, the EU means the textile industry, agriculture, food, metals, and mineral extraction. There's another group for companies publicly listed on the stock exchange, having more than 50 employees and generating a turnover of more than 8 million euros. And then it's also something that will affect non-EU companies. Some companies having a turnover in the European Union of more than 40 million euros, and companies having at least 30% of their turnover generated in high-risk sectors with a turnover of more than 8 million euros generated in the EU. Small and medium enterprises are not directly in the scope of this proposal, though the EU Parliament and the EU in these initiatives is encouraging companies to, when they implement the human rights due diligence process, to support SMEs in their value chain. So I introduced earlier the framework of human rights due diligence. Well, here you can see that the requirements of the directive are aligned with this framework. It requires companies to integrate due diligence into policies, to identify the risks, like the actual and the potential risk of negative environmental impacts and human rights impacts, to prevent, mitigate, bring to an end those impacts. And a very important component of this directive is that it requires companies to establish and maintain complaint procedures, so grievance mechanism. This is a system that will ensure that workers can report concerns and violations. So this is a key steps for companies willing to understand the type of risks in their supply chains and address the concerns of workers and eventually protect them. Companies will be also required to monitor the effectiveness of the due diligence program and to publicly communicate on the due diligence initiative, the process that was implemented, but also what are the risks for the company and what actions are taken by the company to address those risks. Companies, if a company is not complying with this directive, what should happen? Well, there will be sanctions and fines for businesses, but it will depend on the rules that will be decided by member states when they have to translate that into their national law. So it will really depend on each state. The EU directive will also include provision for civil liability, which means that victims will be able to go to court and hold companies accountable for the damages that have been done. There are different conditions that can for a company to be held liable. The first one is if there is damage caused to a natural or legal person, if there is a breach of the duty of due diligence, if there is a link between the damage and the breach of the duty, or if a fault was committed. Companies not complying with the directive also can suffer from reputational damage. We've seen more and more articles of, companies finding issues of forced labor in their supply chains. So if it's better to prevent risks rather than having to fix them, and problems than having to fix the problems. So that's a risk for the companies if they do not implement a system to address those issues in their supply chains. It is also a concern for investors. As you know, there is growing momentum for ESG, and the S component of ESG is, companies have been focusing on the E, everything related to the environment, but the investors are also looking at the S, and they like to invest in companies that are respectful to people working in the supply chains, that have a modern slavery strategy, and that are implementing due diligence system in their supply chains. And finally, another consequence is consumer boycotts. More and more consumers, especially millennials, are more and more aware of those issues of workers being exploited in supply chains, and they are requiring companies to be more ethical and to create more ethical and sustainable products. I just want to mention some differences between the EU and the German law. As you may know, in Germany, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act just entered into force in January 2023. And it's also a law that is requiring companies to implement due diligence in their supply chains, also covering human rights and the environment. The difference is the scope, because the German law is just applicable to German companies. In terms of reporting, it requires companies to add information on their website, while the EU directive will require companies to make public commitments. There is no civil liability provision in the German law, and also in terms of sanctions, it's going to be different since member states will have to decide on penalty in each state. And that's it. If you have questions related to this directive, we'll be happy to answer at the end of the session. Miriam, over to you.
Thank you, Clemence, and that's very clear. And I think it's now up to how can businesses meet these requirements, and what tools are there to support businesses as well as resources. And so IOM, and next slide. So IOM is committed to supporting businesses fulfill their obligations. And this really includes helping businesses identify, mitigate, and address human and labor rights risks. So with that, we developed a suite of tools and resources that can support with meeting the certain requirements, but also really aligning to the UN guiding principles. Next slide. So IOM developed the Fair and Ethical Recruitment Due Diligence Toolkit. It's a really complex toolkit with many tools. And so with that, I will, I'll just play a quick video because it's quite a complex toolkit, and then I'll deep dive into the remediation management tool.
Whether it's a restaurant in London or a factory in Bangkok, your business enterprise could be benefiting from the recruitment of migrant workers. No matter where they're from or what they do, migrant workers contribute greatly to both their countries of origin and their countries of destination. But while most migrant workers have a positive migration experience, some are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Global estimates on modern slavery indicate there are 28 million victims of forced labor globally. The prevalence of forced labor among migrant workers is more than 3 times higher than that of non-migrant workers. And these workers are at an especially high risk during recruitment. Corrupt labor recruiters and sub-agents often charge excessive recruitment fees. Migrant workers might sign employment contracts with exploitative terms and conditions. And when they make it to their country of destination, they often have limited access to legal representation. But now, businesses can find support with the Fair and Ethical Recruitment Due Diligence Toolkit. It was developed in consultation with experts and practitioners in labor migration and human rights due diligence, and tested in the global supply chain. The toolkit is a comprehensive how-to guide with practical tools for implementing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as IOM's Migrant Worker Guidelines for Employers. It follows the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct framework. It can help you to create or improve your due diligence process. Due diligence is an ongoing risk management process in which businesses identify and address any adverse human rights impacts in recruitment activities. And since each business is different, you can customize the tools to fit your unique employment chains and challenges. The toolkit demonstrates the 4 due diligence processes and supporting measures. Even with the best intentions, complex supply chains mean that businesses may cause, contribute to, or be directly linked to human and labor rights violations of migrant workers. But with an effective due diligence process, your business can uphold international standards for fair and ethical recruitment, protecting and empowering migrant workers throughout your supply chain.
So this toolkit was especially developed in cooperation with Apple. So it was a long collaboration looking at the different tools and the different requirements, and it has been trialed with various suppliers across different jurisdictions to test it out and to ensure that all of the relevant toolkits, tools within the toolkits are useful. It's open source, so this is available to anyone, and it can be downloaded from our website, and I'll post the link into the chat. So going on to remediation, to make sure that everyone is on the same page, what does remediation mean? So remediation, as defined by the UN Guiding Principles, is an attempt to right a wrong, to correct as far as possible an injustice. So it refers to both the process and the outcome of addressing adverse human rights impacts. So a remedy may include apologies, restitution, rehabilitation, financial or non-financial compensation, and punitive action, whether criminal or administrative, as well as the prevention of harm through, for example, injunctions or guaranteed of non-repetition. Next slide. So there are multiple ways to identify needs for remediation. So this can be through due diligence, which includes risk identification and assessment process, proactive monitoring and of due diligence implementation, and continuous worker engagement. So that can be looking at conducting worker interviews on a regular basis or having kind of a worker voice tools in place. And then on the second level, it can be through grievance mechanisms. Now, it's important to note that grievance management is not necessarily a component of due diligence, but a separate critical measure that interacts with and may in turn support due diligence by providing channels through which the business can become aware of and respond to adverse impacts. Next slide. So a remediation response may include actions in two levels. Level one, looking at addressing active cases requiring immediate attention. And then a level two, looking at strengthening due diligence and management systems to prevent the same issue from recurring. Slide. So within the toolkit, which once again has different sections, up to 6 tools. So this slide here shows an overview of the toolkit and where the grievance and remediation tools that will be featured can be found. So the grievance and remediation management tool, which can be found in chapter 6, and the grievance and remediation monitoring tool, which can be found under chapter 4. Next slide. So the grievance and remediation management tool is designed to support businesses in facilitating grievance management and remediation. So this includes a grievance form for workers and a version for management, an investigation report, a remediation action, and a remediation action plan template, and a worker feedback. So it's important to note that this tool itself can be used in managing a single grievance report. So it can include sensitive information that should only be accessed by individuals directly involved in handling the grievance case. So businesses may use this grievance remediation monitoring tool to log high-level information about the grievance case that is handling. So this toolkit is very interactive and prompts with, or just moves to the next section as necessary. Next slide. And then the grievance remediation monitoring tool, which is to help businesses obtain a comprehensive overview of all the grievances they handle. So as you can see on the logging of grievance cases, this will provide a bigger picture of all the different cases that have been logged. And then on the grievance management dashboard, which will also look at the cases that have been identified, the types of cases, ongoing grievances, and will also help analyze and identify key trends and challenges in the businesses with regards to their fair and ethical recruitment and grievance management. Next slide. So for further guidance on the remediation management, you can also look at the IOM's operational guidance for business and remediation of migrant workers. This guideline provides a more detailed guidance on establishing and managing grievance mechanisms for migrant workers. It also provides guidance in developing voluntary programs to remediate worker grievances. So looking at the level 2 response to strengthen due diligence and management systems. Next slide. So this looks at the correction action plan and monitoring tools, which can be found under sections 3 and under section 4 of the toolkit. Slide. So the corrective action plan template is connected to the self-assessment checklist in the toolkit, and this is the kind of the initial tool within the toolkit. And the identified due diligence risks and gaps from self-assessment exercise are directly reflected in the corrective action plan template. The corrective action plan template includes recommendations and instructions on the next due diligence steps based on the self-assessment results. So the recommendations are based on the best practices and relevant international standards, such as, once again, the UNGP's OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct and IOM's migrant worker guidelines. And as you can see, it's quite a comprehensive list of questions and recommendations, and these would have been prompted throughout the different tools as you go through with risk assessment, but also other completing the other tools, and then the correction action plan will generate at the end. Next. So the toolkit, once again, supports monitoring the due diligence and implementation effectiveness. So the tools have built-in features that can help users keep track of their due diligence process. The toolkit also includes an overall due diligence monitoring tool, so where progress for different due diligence processes such as training, corrective action plan, worker interviews, grievance monitoring can be consolidated. Consolidated information can then be reflected in the dashboard, such as this slide here, which can be used as a reporting template to help share due diligence status with external and internal and external stakeholders, which can also be used for social audits and the ESG reports. I think, as Clemence already mentioned, this is something that investors are really looking at. So this is, a report at the end of the due diligence toolkit, which can be generated. So for more detailed guidance in establishing fair and ethical due diligence and improving migrant worker management practices, so you can also refer to the narrative guide of the Fair and Ethical Recruitment Due Diligence Toolkit, which once again will be posted in the chat, and the Migrant Worker Guideline for Employers. Next slide. In addition, to improve the capacity of HR staff and professionals, and also the sustainability staff, IOM also has a free of charge e-course, which helps to build understanding of labor migration processes, risks involved, and ways to address those risks. And then for practical examples of how other companies dealt with the issues that they're facing, you can refer to the IOM's Indo-Pacific Guidelines, which provides real-life case studies of how other businesses have worked alone or collaborated with governments and civil society actors to address the same issues. And back over to you, Clemence.
Thank you, Miriam, for introducing the tools that your team has created. It seems really comprehensive and practical. So now I'm going to introduce a tool that we created at the Mekong Club. I think our tools can complement each other. Our tool is a guidance document. It is aimed to help businesses identify and remediate cases of exploitative labor practices in our supply chains. It is primarily focused on Asia Pacific, and it includes information on the applicable laws in key sourcing locations in Asia Pacific. The way we look at remediation is that we consider that companies should assume that there might be some issues in order to implement a system that will be effective to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remediate. And that's how we designed this toolkit as a guidance document. There are 4 categories, 4 main steps of remediation that are detailed in the toolkit, that are preparation, communication, investigation, and remedy. So this is a PDF document, but it was initially designed as a flow chart. So you can go from one step to another and have a big picture of the step that companies should take if they want to remediate forced labor cases, and also go into details when it comes to some of those steps. We have included some links to other guidance documents, external resources, many of IOM resources actually, in this guidance documents. Before introducing the tool, so that tool is available on our website for our members. And if you're interested, you can reach out to me. There's my email address that you will see in the slides of the presentation. we can talk about it. And just like I would like to share some things that we believe are important to take into consideration when providing remediation. The first thing is that it's really, and that's why our first step is preparation. It's really important to be well prepared. And as I say, to assume that there might be some issues in your supply chain so that you prepare an action plan to address those potential problems, and that you establish mechanisms, work with technologies, gather data, and partner with other organizations on the ground to ensure that those problems will be addressed. Another consideration is that it's important that companies are proactive when identifying violations, because sometimes even if you have a grievance mechanism or like that you have implemented a worker voice solution, workers might not necessarily come forward and talk about their problems. So it's important to do your best to collaborate with different stakeholders to make sure that you will understand the kind of issues that might occur in your supply chain. Another thing is when you encounter a problem with suppliers, we think that disengagement from the business relationship should be the last resort. Because if you you identify a problem and you're not working with the supplier to address this and you just walk away, well, the workers will be impacted. So we really recommend companies working together with suppliers, try to find solution, to work on corrective action plan. And then if there is, it's very difficult to find a solution, consider ending the business relationship. We also believe that when providing remediation, it's important to keep workers in the loop and to make sure they have a voice, because sometimes it's difficult. We cannot understand the issues they are facing and what they've been through. Like sometimes we would assume that migrant workers want to go home, but it might not be the case. So it's really important to engage workers in this process. And finally, last recommendation is that when you identify issues, it's important not to remedy only the problem, but also the causes of the problem, to conduct root cause analysis to figure out why this occurred and what are the causes, and try to also work on this, because when it comes to exploitation in supply chain, those issues are systemic. So it's important to try to understand the big picture and the causes of those violations. So as I said, our remediation toolkit is divided in 4 sections and different steps. So I'm just going to briefly introduce some of the steps and share some considerations that we believe are important. So when a company is willing to conduct, when a company is thinking about remediation, the first thing is to see if there is a risk, if there are any violations in the supply chain. So to conduct risk assessment, to look at different types of risks in high-risk geographies, in high-risk sectors, but also not only those risks, but also the risk of issues that may happen to vulnerable populations like migrant workers or women in some countries. So it's important to collect data to understand if your suppliers are operating, where they're operating, and if they have a large number of migrant workers, if they are outsourcing, subcontracting, if they are working with employment agencies or recruitment agencies. Then there are some other science data that you can collect from your suppliers on incidents that happen, issues with contracts, if there are no policies on health and safety. Those issues sometimes might also show signs that there are other non-compliance in other domain and aspects, and that they might be exposed, or that workers could be exposed to forced labor risks. Then once you have identified the risk, another step of preparation is to clearly communicate your requirements, to have, I guess that most of the company joining the call today already have a code of conduct, but to ensure that the code of conduct is meeting standards, country labor laws, obligation to buyers, and that also it respects your company's values. When you prepare for that, it's also important to plan incident management, to have a team that is trained, to ensure that different departments are also involved in that process, such as the legal department, the procurement, or buyers sometimes, because they can influence those decisions, the CSR department, and also the PR media relation department, because sometimes it's important to think about when you're working on remediation, it's important to think about the message that you communicate to other stakeholders, to ensure that you're being transparent on what you're doing. And in the preparation for remediation, also, it's important to have a robust monitoring system, social compliance monitoring system. If you're conducting or working with third party to require social audits, well, look at what could be improved to better address forced labor or human rights violations. Ensure that workers, as I said earlier, have a voice and that they can provide feedbacks through worker voice solution, or also it's important to implement grievance mechanism as required by the German and the EU law. And finally, when you're preparing for this, another consideration is to ensure that your procurement practices or purchasing practices are in line with your requirements. There's a very interesting organization, Better Buying, that is looking at the influence of purchasing practices and working conditions. And yeah, in some cases, it's been proven that if you have poor purchasing practices, it can impact working conditions in factories or farm or production facilities. So those are different things to consider when preparing for identifying the risk and remediating violations. So this is just to show the structure of the guide. So for each of those steps, we're providing details. But today I'm not going to introduce the guide. I'm just going to briefly introduce the steps. Another step is to ensure that you're effectively communicating. When companies are providing remediation, there are different actors involved. So it's important first to take into consideration their concerns, but also to engage with them. You might have obligation to industry associations. You might want to work together with industry peers to have more leverage when you identify an issue within a production facility. Some companies are working together and agreeing on joint actions and joining industry initiatives, and have standards that are industry recognized to ensure first that they have requirements that are the same for suppliers in an industry, but also to ensure that there's a process when it comes to remediation and addressing cases and labor violations. It's also important to engage with suppliers, not only the suppliers that are concerned, but like if you have an issue in the lower tiers of your supply chain, you might want to engage with intermediary suppliers, and then engage with organizations on the ground that can understand the context or help protect workers in certain situations. And finally, engage with a supplier if the problem is occurring in the production facility. And then we think communicating is important also because it's important to be clear on the actions that you're implementing. It's also, communication is also something that is required by the German law and the EU directive. So it's important to have a clear message on the activities that your company is implementing in terms of remediation, and be able to respond to allegations in a timely manner. The reports, the guidance document is providing information on how to conduct investigation. It's really important to understand why you want to conduct investigation, and what are you looking for. If it's to establish where the supplier practices and performance are not in line with local legislation or your code of conduct. It might be to document evidence that are including forced labor victims and witness testimony. It can be to determine the causes of the violation or to establish the extent of the harm, including financial burden to the victims. What is really important is to ensure that your process in terms of investigation is transparent and well documented, and that you keep data collected confidential to protect the workers. Then when you're conducting the investigation, it requires some planning and developing an investigation plan, collecting information, understanding which sites will be selected, getting the supplier consent, decided whether or not it's going to be an announced visit, and also have a team that is in charge and that have the skills to conduct the investigation or to work with a third party that can help. And the most important thing, especially when it comes to addressing issues where the migrant workers have suffered from, is that it's important to ensure that people involved in the investigation can speak different language and the local language, especially in factories or farms or production facilities where you have migrant workers coming from different countries. So if you want to collect like feedback and accurate data from the workers, it's important to speak their language. Investigations can be risky, and we're providing some details in the guidance document on this, but it can be risky for workers, for the safety. It can result in loss of employment and trauma, and also it can be risky for the investigation team. Also, the evidence that you're gonna collect during the investigation might be contaminated or destroyed. So sometimes it might be difficult to get data to verify something that like a violation, and to ensure that things have happened, and then to provide effective remediation. And so when conducting the investigation, it's important to document everything, and then when you analyze the data, to work on plans together. I mean, like when there's a problem, as I mentioned earlier, we really think it's important to collaborate with suppliers to try to remediate and to do like your best to ensure that they understand your concern, why it's important for you as a company, and try to work on the implementation of the corrective action plan and on the follow-up. And finally, I'm going to briefly introduce the last section that we detail in this guidance document, which is how to provide remedy, what to do when it's been the cases and the violations were verified, what kind of actions you can take, and how to address those specific violations. So we're providing details on considerations, policy, and remedial action that you can implement if you have issues with recruitment fees, contract permit issues, payment issues, overtime issues, withholding of identification documents, deprivation of liberty, intimidation, threat, and violence, and debt bondage. And the last step that we mentioned is this document is really important to have a system in place to monitor those potential issues, because if you have an efficient system that is combining different data collection methodology like audits, enhanced communication with suppliers, worker surveys, and a solid grievance mechanism, you might have less risk of this situation to happen again. So when providing remediation, we also recommend working on your monitoring system to ensure that you're also preventing those risks.